When we hear the term the Middle Ages, many people immediately think of darkness, ignorance, and backwardness. It's an image that many of us encountered during our schooling. The problem is that this image is incomplete. History is often simplified. Within limited time, complex periods are reduced to short labels and catchphrases that are easy to remember, but rarely capture the full reality. In this video, I'll examine some of the most common myths about the Middle Ages. We'll look at how they emerged and compare them with what historical sources actually tell us. Because perhaps the Middle Ages were not a dark age, but a period that was simply different from our modern world. And we'll begin with the most famous myth of all. One of the most common ideas about the Middle Ages is that they were a dark age, a time of decline, ignorance, and stagnation. But this idea didn't come from the Middle Ages themselves. It was created much later. During the Renaissance, scholars wanted to present their own time as a rebirth. To do that, they compared themselves to antiquity and cast everything in between into darkness. Another problem is that we often talk about the Middle Ages as if they were a single, uniform period. In reality, they lasted nearly 1,000 years, and they were very different from beginning to end. During this time, cities grew, universities emerged, legal systems, philosophy, and science continued to develop. That doesn't look like complete darkness. Of course, the Middle Ages had wars, plagues, and deep inequality. Life was hard and often dangerous, but hardship does not mean the absence of progress. The Middle Ages were not a dark age. They were a different age, an age of gradual change, local solutions, and foundations that shaped the modern world. So if the Middle Ages weren't dark, does that mean people were ignorant? Let's look at the next myth. Another common belief is that people in the Middle Ages were ignorant, that they lacked knowledge, skills, and understanding. But first, we need to clarify something. Being illiterate does not mean being unintelligent. Reading and writing were skills tied to specific roles. Clergy, administrators, and merchants needed them. Most people did not. That doesn't mean knowledge disappeared. Texts were preserved in monasteries. Books were copied by hand, generation after generation. In fact, universities were founded during the Middle Ages. Places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, centers of learning that still exist today. Most people learned through experience, through work, family, and community. Skills were passed down, not written down. So illiteracy did not make medieval people foolish. They lived within a different system of knowledge, not an inferior one. And this brings us to another popular myth, that medieval people were dirty and never bathed. Another very common belief is that people in the Middle Ages were dirty, that they never bathed and didn't care about cleanliness. This image mostly comes from later sources, especially descriptions linked to plagues, poverty, and periods of crisis, not from everyday medieval life. Bathing did exist in the Middle Ages, especially in towns and cities. Many medieval cities had public bathhouses. They were inspired by Roman traditions and served as social spaces, not just places to wash. Cleanliness didn't mean bathing alone. People washed their hands and faces regularly. They changed their clothes and cared about personal grooming. Of course, hygiene depended on many factors. Whether you lived in a city or the countryside, whether you were rich or poor, and whether you lived in Northern or Southern Europe. Medieval hygiene was different from ours, but different does not mean dirty. People understood the importance of cleanliness within their own world. So if medieval people weren't dirty, what about another famous belief? Did they really think the earth was flat? One of the most famous myths about the Middle Ages is the idea that people believed the earth was flat. But this belief isn't medieval at all. Even in ancient times, educated scholars knew the earth was round. Greek thinkers even calculated its size with surprising accuracy. That knowledge did not disappear after antiquity. It was preserved, studied, and passed on through monasteries, Islamic scholars, and medieval schools. Educated people in the Middle Ages knew the earth was round. This was part of formal education. It was taught, not debated. So where does the idea of a flat earth Middle Ages come from? Mostly from the 19th century, from simplified history and from narratives that wanted to portray the past as ignorant and backward. Ferdinand Magellan did not prove the Earth was round. People already knew that. The real debate was about how large the Earth was. So the idea that medieval people believed in a flat Earth is a modern myth. It tells us more about how we remember the Middle Ages than about the Middle Ages themselves. And this brings us to the final misconception, that the Middle Ages were nothing but war, feudal lords, and violence. When people imagine the Middle Ages, they often picture battles, knights, castles, swords, and constant violence. But that image tells only part of the story. War is dramatic. It changes borders and rulers. That's why it dominates historical narratives. But most medieval people were not soldiers. They were farmers, craftsmen, traders, and families. Their lives were shaped far more by work than by war. During the Middle Ages, cities grew, trade expanded, guilds regulated labor, quality, and prices. People lived within legal systems. They signed contracts. They went to court to settle disputes. This was not a lawless world. Life was not constant chaos. Families worked, celebrated, and planned for the future. Most days were ordinary, not violent. Violence stands out in history. Peaceful daily life rarely makes headlines. Yet it was peace that allowed societies to function. War was part of medieval life, but it was not all of it. Most of medieval history was lived far from the battlefield. So if the Middle Ages were not just dark, ignorant, dirty, or violent, how should we really understand them? Let's put all these myths together. Let's briefly recap what we've just covered. The Middle Ages were not a dark age. People were not ignorant. They were not constantly dirty. They did not believe the earth was flat. And medieval life was not only about war. The problem with these myths isn't just that they're wrong, it's that they reduce history to something black and white. And real history is never that simple. The Middle Ages were complex. They were uneven. And above all, they were human. Different regions, different centuries, different experiences. Understanding this matters, because the Middle Ages shaped the world we live in today. Our cities, universities, legal systems, and institutions didn't appear out of nowhere. The Middle Ages were not a step backward. They were the foundation on which the modern world was built. Without them, our present wouldn't exist. So let me ask you this. What surprised you the most in this video? Was there a myth you believed until today? If you enjoy history explained clearly and without myths, subscribe to the channel. Because history makes much more sense when we take the time to truly understand it.